The Korean War divided one country into two. Here's why. Before 1950, there was no North Korea or South Korea. There was just Korea, a single country ruled by an emperor. But after World War II, the Soviets occupied the North and the Americans occupied the South. The plan was to eventually unify the country, but that plan fell apart when the North set up its own communist government and the South set up its own non-communist government. Both sides started claiming that they were the true legitimate government of all of Korea. The US-backed South Korea claimed that they had the backing of the United Nations, and the Soviet-backed North Korea claimed that they were the true democratic representatives of the people. Neither side would back down. So in 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, starting the Korean War. The war started badly for South Korea. Within 2 months of the invasion, most of the country was under the control of the North. But then the tide of the war turned when the United Nations sent in troops to help defend South Korea. The fighting continued like this for another 2 years. By 1953, both sides were exhausted and ready to finally make a peace treaty. The treaty divided the peninsula along the 38th parallel, basically giving the north half of Korea to North Korea and the south half of Korea to South Korea. And that's why today we have North Korea and South Korea. But there's one big thing that you probably don't know about this war. It was one of the first conflicts of the Cold War. In fact, it's often referred to as a proxy war of the Cold War. You see, during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly. They fought each other indirectly through smaller conflicts like in Korea. Each side would back different factions in these conflicts, like the US backed South Korea and the Soviet Union backed North Korea. This conflict was important because if the communists had won, then the entire peninsula would have become communist, which would have been a big problem for the Americans. But the Korean War wasn't just a fight between the North and the South, or the US and the Soviets. There was also China. At the start of the war, China didn't like that the Soviets and the Americans were fighting each other on their border. In fact, they told the North to stop the war, but when it looked like the North was going to lose, China sent in their troops to help them out. China had their own issues with the Americans occupying a part of Korea, because it meant that the Americans were close to Chinese borders. China felt threatened by this, so that's why China helped North Korea. So you might be wondering, why did the Americans even get involved in the first place? Well, it comes down to one word: containment. The US had this policy called containment, which was designed to stop the spread of communism. They got involved in Korea because they saw it as a way to stop communism from spreading to another country. The Americans didn't want an aggressive communist power on their doorstep. And it wasn't just the Americans who were worried about communism spreading. The Soviets were worried about it too. That's why they supported North Korea. They didn't want an aggressive capitalist power on their doorstep either. After the war, the peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel. The fighting stopped and the two Koreas became separate countries. Today, the two Koreas are still technically at war. They never signed a peace treaty, they just signed an armistice, which basically means a pause in the fighting. North Korea and South Korea are still technically enemies. If you want to learn more about the Cold War, stay tuned for more information. And thank you for watching.